For the Stanford AIME Happy Hour. I'm so excited to ask some questions to my fellow panelists. So we're going to get started and let them introduce themselves. I have a specific question that I would like each of them to kind of start us off with, particularly since we're talking about specific clinical problems today. So I'm just going to say the panelist's name and they're going to answer this question. So the question is, what's a specific clinical problem, diagnosis, or condition that you've worked on using imaging or other clinical data? And of course, machine learning, AI, neural networks. So on my Brady Bunch screen, the first one up there is David. So David, we'll go first. I'll let you tell us something specific that you're working on.
All right. Well, good morning. I'm a cardiologist at Cedars-Sinai, and I'm an echocardiographer. I would say the specific clinical question, expanding both in cardiology and outside of cardiology, is really the question of human variance. The way that we read imaging and make medical diagnoses has a lot of variance. And I think that machine learning is an opportunity to understand really kind of how much is appropriate variance and how to get more precise diagnosis.
Cool. Thank you. Next on my screen is Jared. Jared, can you give a little intro and what's something specific that you're working on?
Yeah, good afternoon. There's Jared Dunman. I'm currently the technical director for AI at the Defense Innovation Unit, where we work on a couple of health projects there. And I'm still a visiting scholar over at Stanford, where on the research side, what I mostly focus on is building systems for, in places like imaging, in places like time series data, video, et cetera, where we don't necessarily have a ton of labeled data, and we're trying to find ways to leverage all the information we have to be able to build models that do something useful for us. Specific problems that I've tended to work on, things like work list prioritization for various imaging modalities, things like seizure detection and classification on the EEG, and then leveraging some high level types of supervision. So maybe I supervise at a scan level, and it turns out that models often learn really, really useful and interesting things, even when you supervise them at a very coarse level, and working on figuring out how we can actually use some of that information that the model has learned to build out more pieces of information that the clinician can actually use. So that's where I spend most of my time.
Cool. Thank you. Susan, how about if you go next?
Oh, terrific. Thanks, Todd. I don't know where I don't know where David is, but he said good morning. So where it is for me is good evening. But I'm Susan Wood. I'm the CEO of Vita. Thanks for having me. A specific problem that I'm working on, or we are working on, is one that is predicting post-surgical lung function for patients for lung cancer resection. So to be able to determine their lung function before the procedure, and understanding how much of the cancer in the lung to take out, and so we could predict post-surgical lung function. I'm sort of old school. I've been in the Silicon Valley for a while. We've had my initial company was a company called R2 Technology, which was kind of the matriarch for screening mammography, finding cancers in screening mammograms, and now incorporating a risk assessment in those procedures as well.
Awesome. Thank you. Serena, how about you go next?
Everyone, my name is Serena Young. I'm an assistant professor of biomedical data science at Stanford. And my interests are particularly focused around computer vision and making sense of diverse types of visual biomedical data. One for specific clinical problems, I would say, one area that we have been working in is in surgery. And one particular kind of question I'm interested in is trying to extract as much detailed information about what's happening in these types of data. So for example, surgical videos, and to be able to use that to extract new insights about what's happening during these surgeries, what's indicative of either better skill, of what kinds of decision making can lead to better sorts of outcomes. And so trying to gain as much of sort of new insights using detailed visual analysis as possible.
Cool. Thank you. And last but not least, Iman, how about you introduce yourself, please?
Hey, I'm Iman Banerjee. I'm an assistant professor in Emory with joint affiliation in biomedical informatics and radiology. I am also an assistant professor in Georgia Tech in biomedical engineering department. And my main research interest is actually multimodal data analysis. So I do a lot of computer vision tasks as well as natural language processing tasks, because that the clinical notes actually contains also very rich information. So the whole idea is that how we can actually integrate that rich information from clinical notes like discharge summary, oncology notes, progression notes, pathology report, radiology report, and the images together to build any kind of prognosis or predictive models. And that's my research area. So for the specific task, I'm not very bound to any particular specific task, but my main interest is working on the cancer informatics. So I do a lot of cancer informatics research, mainly for breast cancer, like recurrence prediction, lung cancer, recurrence diagnosis, early screening, this kind of task, as well as we do a lot of cardiovascular tasks. So yeah, so that's my main interest.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you guys very much for the generous introductions. I'm a radiologist by background, so we have a really nice blend on this panel between academics and the industry and clinical and research. And so my first question is going to be, if we had a kind of a silver ball, we could pick anything we wanted. We had an infinite amount of properly labeled image data. How would you prioritize what algorithm to build? Would you do it with disease prevalence or greatest mortality, cost savings, maximize resource, personal attachment to it, or something else? And so I'll let you guys chime in at first, but if not, I can start to call people. So I'll let you guys chime in first. So what would you build if you had infinite resources that were labeled properly?
It sounds like really fantastic because we never get that. Yeah. Yeah. But I said, please go on. Yeah.
Well, while you're thinking, so we have like 110 FDA approved right now. FDA approved image algorithms, only 110, and radiologists we need 10,000. So we have essentially none. We need to get more and more and more to answer all the things that I look at on a screen. And so because right now we have to see where the data is, and then we have to use the data to direct it. So if we had to think the other way around, what would you look for?
So I was on mute. I'm sorry. I was trying to figure out my button here. So I just to start the conversation, and you're saying that we have whatever we need here, and we all are looking for what we need. would it be cost? Would it be prevalence? Would it be mortality? I would say yes. But I would go upstream and look at population health and be able to determine risk assessment, being able to notify or triage these patients into, or not patients yet, but into the population to get tests and or early indicators or early risk of disease, and to be able to use a lot of this information upstream in the process.
Yeah, good. I'll add on a couple as well. I think a few broad areas that I'm very excited about. One, I kind of alluded to earlier with the surgical videos, but I think trying to obtain new insights and knowledge just from detailed analysis of large populations about understanding sort of trajectories and patterns, and then being able to use that across large populations to make better personalized decisions with respect to care and treatment. I think that's one broad area, and then another area that I think is that I'm very excited about is about just sort of use of these algorithms in general to be able to help clinicians be sort of more efficient and more efficient in their work, and essentially to try and combat some of what I think is this current issue and an increasing issue of all kinds of clinicians and nurses being overburdened. And certainly, for example, I know some of you working with triaging and radiology is one common example of this. And another area that we work in as well is trying to look at sort of patient monitoring in hospitals using visual sensors and ambient intelligence embedded in hospital spaces. And again, all that is sort of geared towards how can we also use sort of the automation and the scale at which AI is able to easily operate to be able to make life easier for clinicians and to help them be able to focus more on sort of the more either nuanced or challenging or personal interaction and decision-making aspects of clinical care. Maybe a couple additional areas that I'd add in.
Love it.
I would just tack on. Yeah, I just tack on to what Serena said on efficiency, where I'm an engineer at heart. So usually when I look at something and I look at an overall problem, which is the problem of delivering care to a particular individual or population, there's physicians that traditionally provide that care. And if you look at their workflows, like almost any human workflow, you can figure out where are they spending the most of their time, and which pieces of that time are the most important and most meaningful and most valuable. And particularly in the current world in imaging, and not just in imaging, in diagnostic medicine, where again, like EEGs is a great example. You have EEGs that last for days all the time, and people can't read them. So there are places where humans are, they spend their time on things that don't necessarily benefit from their expertise. So identifying those places and trying to use machine learning and automation to try to maximize the capacity factor of our clinicians in terms of where they're spending their time, making that as meaningful as possible. And then secondly, there's a set of problems where human beings physically cannot process a certain amount of information. If I have, no doctor, you're never going to go to a doctor and they're never going to look at your entire EMR. They just can't do it every single time. Being able to find applications where we can benefit from looking at extremely large amounts of information, not just from a training data set size, but extremely large, sets of different types of information at once. That's another kind of pattern that I look for, just in a way that humans would find hard to integrate. And there's a third one that I think is maybe, I think we're starting to see, but I think it's more nascent than some of the others. I think there's a really compelling interaction here between where machine learning and some of these learned objects are going, and our ability to do basic science, not only in being able to supercharge our ability to read, for instance, diagnostics, interpret data that are coming out of noisy diagnostics, et cetera, in the basic science context, but also being able to do things like design art, synthetic biomarkers for disease, to be able to better understand the mechanism of disease by looking at the different types of data that we have about it in a larger scale and more structured way than we might otherwise. So that piece about using what we learn by applying these systems in the real world to build a better understanding of the underlying biological systems that we use in medicine, that we kind of work with every day in medicine, is something that I think is really exciting. So long answer, but I'll stop.
I think
Iman, I have a question for you, kind of dovetailing off this. If you had perfect NLP to mine all the text that, like, if it was literally perfect, like what would be the next thing you would start to work on?
Yeah, so actually, this is a nice question, and I would refer to one NCI grant that was just like published, and we submitted to that grant, and this was a perfect example that what kind of NLP and multimodal data can do, because I don't know if you guys like aware of that, like there are multi-million-dollar spending on SEER, right? The SEER cancer registry for data curation, because we don't really have long-term outcome data of the cancer patient, like recurrence, treatments, and all these things. And even like hospitals, even like NCI, they are spending millions of dollars for curating that data, even if we don't have that complete data yet. So any kind of population-based study on the cancer patient is limited because we don't have that like large-scale data. And that actually restricts ourselves, even like state-wise, as a nation-wise, even like third world country, they are also spending a lot of money on that kind of data curation, you know. So I think that is a huge limitation. But the main problem of that data curation is that even for just curating the treatment, you know, so it's not only a single source information. You need to compile actually multiple source. You need to compile the claims data. You need to compile the progression notes, because patients are moving from one hospital system to another hospital system. So it's not that easy, right? So the idea would be like, if we can at least get like a common EHR where we can track at least all the patients across the nation, that would be really nice. Like we can really curate that kind of outcome data. I know that is kind of, again, it's not possible in like near future, but at least that would be really nice.
I like the thought process. David, do you have something specific? Because if not, I have a question.
Yeah, I guess ripping off of kind of Serena and Jared's point, I would actually say that if resources weren't an issue, going back to the idea of both precision medicine as well as having a lot of data, I think the main task we have in front of us is essentially defining normal. I think there's sufficient heterogeneity across populations, across people, across, I think Iman's mentioned, across kind of institutions and across organizations, that defining what's normal is really, I think, the most compelling question, because that allows us to really identify when things become abnormal, when things should be relevantly different, and really how much we should actually act upon a lot of the things to essentially intervene early.
And David, actually, I have a corresponding question to you around that. Like, so do you think that normality should be like universal, or do you think that normality should be based on disease domain?
Oh, that's hard. I would say that this goes back to the idea of kind of there's so much label heterogeneity, whether it's a cardiologist, radiologist, dermatologist, how we define, how we measure things really kind of goes to the lens of, is this a sick patient or is this not a sick patient? I think that it is hard to define normal. And I think that that's why it's a really relevant task. For example, I look at echoes all the time, which are cardiac ultrasounds, and then how people measure them has sufficient heterogeneity where one abnormal measurement might be flagged. So we take a look, but it's grossly with kind of essentially a clinical eye or with understanding of the clinical scenario, that might be a mismeasurement, or that might be within the range of normal for that person, like you're saying.
Not by disease, it could be by population as well. Like what would be normal within that population.
And also, like the population again has this subgroup, right? Like the race, age, like all these particular peculiar subgroups. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Every time you add a variable, that increases the dimension, and so it's hard for us to think about that as like a human. But yeah, there could be many dimensions that just make the normal. So great question. And you guys definitely stretch the bounds of it. So good job of really stretching it out for that. So my next question. So I'm a radiologist, and so I know some of you guys do some imaging stuff, and this is one of the reasons why I asked Susan to be on this talk is, what can we extract from the imaging data that I can't do or David can't do? So we can measure the thickness of the ventricle, like that's something like we can physically do, but something I can't physically do is measure the overall lung volume. Like I can't measure the parenchyma of the lung that Susan can do. And so So I just wanted to kind of, let's put our brainstorming hats on and like, what are some things that either you know that we're working on or you think we should work on that a human just can't click and drag and measure on the PACS, but we should be measuring? And I have a few thoughts, but I want to hear what you guys think, and then I can prompt if need be.
Do you want us to go, or do you want
Sure.
us to go? So I'm not a radiologist. I'm an industry now, but a scientist. I think there's so much information from those images that we just don't use. So I think I'm just speaking kind of how you preface this. One of the things that we're doing in images is we're able to find things like air trapping by mapping inspiration, expiration scans of the lung. And so you can find change at a subvoxelar measurement, way beyond what you could find with the human eye. So there's just a lot of information. That's just a kind of example of a really highly resolved result that we can get to measure things like functional small airway disease within the lung. It would be very difficult to measure that, certainly with the naked eye. But in general, with AI and the resolution of the information, we can find things well beyond what a human could find, but would prompt them to distill that information down. A lot of the themes of some, I think Jared said this extraordinarily well. It's like, being able to take that information and distill it down to a level of precision that you can consume it in your decision-making process. And so I think it's both the high resolution information, but also to put it in a way that it's easily consumable, so you can make your clinical decision.
I think the same thing also holds for the pathology, histopathology slides, because there are very subtle changes in the structural level as well as the geometric level, which is impossible to capture through the human eye, even if we spend hours and hours of time looking in the microscope.
Yeah, there's also stuff on the pathology case, I'd say specifically things like mitotic counting, which are just really, really tedious and awful. It's like you could do it, but you're physically not going to be able to do it. Right. So I would, I would change your question a little bit. Just, I would also say things that humans can do, but physically, if given, till the heat death of the universe, but physically can't do in a practice setting. So maybe if you get 3 of the best radiologists in the world and they're looking at the stand, they have infinite time, maybe they could do it. But in reality, in practice, no way. And so a lot of that, finding those places where, and I think you phrased this question exactly right. What would we measure? I would actually say one of the exciting pieces is that we have an ability to decide what we want to measure and then implement a technique for measuring it in a much more rapid and iterable way than we have been in the past. So particularly with some of the deep learning stuff, which is not the only thing in the world, but basically you say, look, I've got a bunch of input data and I've got this indicator that I think might actually be clinically useful to me if I could measure it. Okay, fine. Let's see if we can do it. Let's build this giant nonlinear map and see if we can do it. And if we can, fantastic. And if tomorrow, the American College of blank comes down with a new indicator that says, actually, we think this is better, well, we can try to measure that too. We won't always succeed. But I think that's one of the exciting pieces here is we can iterate on that process of what we're measuring way more quickly than we used to be able to.
Very
cool.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I think there's a phrase, it's like quantity has a quality in of itself. And I think that is very relevant for something like, I think, Ty, you mentioned kind of measuring wall thickness and things like that. When we're dealing with so much information, particularly like a cardiac structure where, the cardiac ultrasounds tend to be videos, a lot of the selection bias that humans do is essentially choosing what frame of that image to measure. Being able to automate that, like the way Jared says, for like KI index or many of the other things, allows for more precise measurements because, in cardiology, we often kind of acquire 4 beats of the heart, but really only measure 1. But if you can actually measure all 4 and then average them, that tends to be a more precise measurement.
I think, and you can also use this ability to measure very, exhaustively to also help you determine what you might want to measure in the first place. But if you sort of can measure at a very fine-grained level across a large population, and then you can try and work backwards and see, what actually impacts outcomes, and then you can use that to also, hooking back into the loop that Jared was talking about, also inform what you're actually going to hone in on and measure in the first place.
By the way, there are also just
David. Okay.
Good. I would say there are also crazy, insane things that we can measure. Like, there's folks that are working on using gaze data to, for instance, try to quantify, where and how a radiologist might be looking at an image and say, okay, well, if you're super tired, your gaze pattern may look something like this, and you may want to have someone give you that a second read. So there's things that data that we're now able to collect that allow us to measure and quantify things in a way that we just wouldn't have been able to think about, even just a couple of years ago.
And that's definitely the spirit of the question, and I totally appreciate that specific example. And on that, I want to ask David another one. When I do the cardiac nuke med scans and I'm looking for like wall motion abnormality, I mean, that's tea leaves. I mean, come on. And so can you think of a way that possibly a super sensitive echo, or maybe some algorithms even applied to the nuke med scans, or something else, a combined nuke med ultrasound? I don't know. Can you think of some way to make that a little bit more specific? I put you on the spot, but I mean, just seeing if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, no, I think that the one thing I want to say is that I think Serena's point is very valid, is that while we have standardized measurements, things like wall motion, or we have a 17-segment model of the heart, so we can say that this is the anterior structure, all of these are ultimately made up. Someone might have made it up 10 years ago because they can do it easily at that point. But we are in a paradigm where we can actually create many more measures. And I think going back to what I think Iman has said, like if we can fuse or integrate different types of imaging, if we can add or kind of integrate things at the same time, there's so many opportunities that really are there that we haven't really explored. And I think that for nuclear medicine, things like amyloidosis is such a relevant and underdiagnosed essentially disease entity that I'm really confident that there probably is some subtle signal or some additional measure that potentially in 10, 15 years, that's what we're going to be looking at.
And since I sort of put David on the spot, Serena, I kind of want to do the same too for the intraoperative stuff. And I don't know exactly what you do, so if this is a bad question, we can just turn it off. But have you tried to tie that in with medical imaging, with surgical imaging, with outcomes? Like, or is there something we can measure there that is not normally measured?
Yeah, so I think we're looking at part of what you said right now, which is what's happening in intraoperative procedures and trying to link with outcomes. So that's something to say. I think a lot of what's been happening during a procedure, besides whatever surgeon notes may have been taken, retrospectively, a lot of what's actually going on at the detailed level is still in some sort of a black box. And so I think here our goal is to extract out the details of what is happening during these surgeries, and then and then link that with the outcomes. The first part of what you mentioned, medical imaging, other types of medical imaging, we have not yet looked into, but I think that would be extremely interesting. Just as for starters, if you're thinking about outcomes and what's happening during a patient, well, certainly every patient's individual status and situation is very important. And so, that certainly gives that some part of that additional context and information. You could imagine, much more as well, trying to look at, sort of the entire other aspects of the health record. And so I think it's a very interesting area. I think it's, we'll tie into multimodality as well, but we haven't gotten to it yet. I think it's still exciting future work.
And then I guess we'll spread out the questions. So Susan, when you originally talked about trying to make predictive measures to try and find out who might be at risk for emphysema or interstitial lung disease, so is there some way that we could possibly start measuring this lung parenchymal volume for some other CT scan, the lung basis for an appendicitis when they're younger, and try and predict if they're at risk for that? Is that something that's on your thought process, or am I off with what you were thinking there?
Well, the finding in a population base, I'm not sure it would be something in a young population, but let's say, I think there's certain, if I understand the question, there's certain risk profile that you'll know coming into either a screen or even a diagnostic procedure. That person, has a risk of something based on their profile, and you would have a way to look at that image with different metrics more intensely because they have they're a risk population. I'll give you kind of an easy example. 10 years from now, somebody's a COVID survivor, right? And they come in and something's happened. We know they're at risk for interstitial lung disease. They may not have necessarily symptoms. They might not have an easy indicator, but you might take a different or a more intense look at that patient. You might be more drill down more in your metrics because that patient has a higher population. Not necessarily a more cumbersome workflow. It would be done in an automated way, but you'd know that person has a higher risk profile for certain diseases downstream.
In that case, it's kind of like what I normally do. I look at the patient, I look at everything, and then I make my impression based on all the information I have. And so giving me a little more extra power, I think it's a great idea.
But to the kind of maybe the previous question, you've got, a huge amount of information that you can't process or certainly can't process easily. So this is all going on in the background and it moves into your mainstream workflow in a seamless way so that you're not just doing your normal judgment. You're having the power of millions behind you that you've seen before and would have similar types of patterns. So you're getting a more powerful second reader or more powerful indicator.
Got it. We have a question in the chat that says, and this is a good segue because we just talked about a couple of different brainstorms of different ways. The question is, how would you turn one of these algorithms into an application? And I think they mean productionalized. And so if one of the things that you guys talked about specifically, if you have an idea how to productionalize it or make it into a platform that could be used, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I can give you an example that, as I mentioned before, that we are actually collaborating with Georgia and California Cancer Registries because we need to validate our algorithm. And you cannot believe, like, the CR registries, even the statewide registries, they are very, very interested in applying those algorithms and for curating the data. Even if it is not 100% perfect, that is okay with them. Even if they can get a baseline and some extracted tokens that talks about that particular outcome, they can even, it's like easy for them to manually evaluate it, right? They don't have to go through these thousands of clinic notes. So yeah, so that's like one thing already in production for us.
Awesome, great example.
Can I jump in? I would say to make them usable, I mean, one of the main things is they have to be certainly workflow integrated. I think that's one of the kind of base points. But I would also suggest that the application itself would need to be generalizable enough that it would be usable across a broad population. So it doesn't have the normal biases you would have in a test environment. It can go out into the production environment without a strong bias.
Right.
Which actually is a good segue to the next question from the internet. And so that one was kind of like an industry question. This is more of like an academic question. So let's see how we do this. So the question is, AI relies on training and validation using human curated data. What if the ground truth is unknown and humans are imperfect? For example, 20% inter-observer reliability. How would you validate your AI?
Yeah, well, I'll say just to start with, if you got 20% inter-reader reliability, that's probably a pretty hard task. But concretely speaking, what we'll often do is this goes into workflow design. So I can design my system such that I am, my output is something that is rather uncertain. I can also design my workflows in ways where I am focused on having outputs that I can validate reasonably well. And then the kind of uncertain pieces of it, I design in kind of a human decision layer on top of. Now, to your point, concretely and operationally, when we have a place where we have inter-rater, variability that's, not 20%, but something, that's not 100%. What we'll often do is just, you baseline against the best thing that you can, right? So in some cases, in clinical cases, I mean, you can have 800 physicians look at something and they'll give you a lot of different answers. So what we'll usually do is say, all right, let's get, for our test sets, for instance, let's get 3 of the best, clinicians in the world that we can in the same room. And, we'll have them look through and kind of either read things individually and then any they conflict on, come to a consensus, these sorts of things. Because a lot of times inter-rater variability comes from not necessarily a different reading of the image or the data, though that can happen. A lot of times it's often a different interpretation of what the labeling schema actually means. And, for instance, if I have stage 3 of a disease versus stage 4 of a disease, like what does that actually mean? People will call that differently. I'll defer to some of the clinicians on the call, but, from a data science standpoint, that's what we do is we usually try to get the consensus of kind of the best folks that we can. And in many ways, it's the best thing we can do. Understanding there will be variability in the ground truth. One of the goals for some of these machine learning systems, though, really is to allow for a relatively repeatable measurement. So, it won't necessarily be perfect, but you can believe, but it should be repeatable in a way that can be positive in some cases. But I would be interested in hearing some of the clinicians on this one.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think one thing that's as you can see across the literature for AI, is that human labels are extremely heterogeneous, whether it's like derm, kind of for echo, or a variety of different projects that are kind of fairly high impact and have been large data sets, that when you do an adjudication kind of committee, the joke is like 4 people will give 5 different answers. But that's something that really you have to deal with in machine learning. For our paper for assessing cardiac function last year, published in Nature, what we actually ended up doing was that for the test set, where there's the biggest discordance between the model prediction and what the label initially said, we actually blinded 3 clinicians to further prospectively evaluate them. So that kind of, here's the input video, here's 2 labels, it's an ejection fraction of 30% versus ejection fraction of 50%. Which one do you prefer? And actually at that time, in a blinded setting, humans actually preferred the model interpretation about kind of 40% of the time, which is really close to random chance, suggesting that this is within the variance of human error. The one thing I also wanted to say is that I think that humans have significant bias, and I think that AI is actually one way to reduce that bias. So kind of, we usually see this in human adjudications because humans, whether it's radiologists or cardiologists, can and do hedge their interpretations. For example, one idea is that kind of the ejection fraction is a number between 0 and 100, so that if you plot the histogram of what that numbers look like, it should be a fairly smooth peak across the distribution of what's normal and abnormal. But if you look at the clinical reports, there's actually peaks. People have biases where they prefer numbers ending in 0 and 5, and the very threshold of clinical decision making, where people don't want to say one way or the other. But kind of our experience is that if we then just input the same videos and a large corpus of data and then train a model on it, essentially that smooths out all the peaks. Models don't necessarily bias towards hedging those circumstances, and a lot of that really comes to the clinical judgment or maybe the medical legal infrastructure.
Yeah,
and I would also.
Sorry, go ahead.
Good. No, go for it.
Yeah, I was just agreeing with David actually. So that's the main important point, that whenever you don't have the ground truth and you want the human to generate the ground truth, it's better to actually appoint multiple human readers rather than having just one, because otherwise you cannot risk hedge out this kind of inter-rater variability in your training data set. And most of the cases, the paper that are published in earlier days of deep learning will see that we will just have one reader, and I don't know like how valid that ground truth is in general, like to have just one reader.
Yeah, and I'll just say one other thing here, which is, and this may be a bit provocative, but there's also cases where, understanding exactly what your errors are and how your schema has been designed is a crucial part of these problems. So for instance, there may be, again, I'm making this up, class 4 and class 5 of a given disease, the intervention may be the same. Like it may not clinically matter. And so there's a lot of cases where people spend their time worrying about, oh, well, my model's making this error all the time, and it's really problematic because, my model's making this error and the humans are actually, they're confusing the two things and I don't know what to do. And sometimes the answer is, well, actually clinically, the intervention's the same. So with that caveat in mind, you may actually make the decision that this model may be useful, even though it can't tell those two things apart very well, because downstream, the action that's going to be taken within the workflow it's designed for is no different.
We have another question from the chat, so I'm going to go over there. I think we could keep chatting on this exact thing. I have some questions too, but the audience is asking questions, so I'm going to keep them happy. So the question is on opportunity imaging. So the example they gave, a chest CT, and maybe you can extract some coronary artery disease if the chest CT was for lung stuff. And so in all of your experiences, what is a traditional image that is gathered, and what are some opportunities we can get from there? Chest CT is kind of pretty ripe. There's lots of things to look in there, but maybe there's some other options for you guys. So who would like to go first?
Yeah, we are doing an opportunity screening with MR abdomen. And we found a lot of interesting outcome from that. You can imagine, like, if you look at MR abdomen and look at like 5 years outcome data, that was an amazing opportunity for us. Yeah, so that paper is still in review.
Got it.
Yeah, I think opportunity imaging, if you have a chest CT, there is a lot of stuff in there usually, and one is to find it. So that's where the kind of the human limitation and the AI helping you, right, to find. But there's, I think that, I mean, look at the lung cancer screen. That's reimbursed for lung cancer. We're finding a lot of emphysema in there, and it's an easy example, but it's comorbid disease, early onset for a lot of earlier diseases. So I think that I just as a general rule, find as much in that image as possible. It's a data-rich environment.
One other part of the question was, and then alert a certain provider. So that's a little bit outside the normal like image evaluation. It's more workflow and more like informatics after. I just want to be fair to the person who asked it. Does anyone have any thoughts on how to structure alerting providers based on what's identified on the image, either automatically or the radiologist? Yeah, a bit outside, I get it, but.
Yeah. I was going to say, I think I really liked the example that the audience member described, which is the idea of evaluating coronary calcium on screening CTs, because I think that even outside of AI, there's a huge variance between what we know we should do and what's actually done in clinical practice. So kind of when we recognize people at high risk for heart disease, they probably should be on aspirin, they probably should be on a statin. And I think the opportunities to identify those people are incredibly relevant. I think the right way to ping, say, the cardiologist, the primary care physician, or other members of the healthcare team is, I think, an open question, but I think that that's ripe for disruption and is ripe for either kind of managed health organizations or kind of researchers doing randomized trials to really evaluate how does that impact, essentially, I think what Susan was saying is such population level health.
And many times my reports, how do I know really what happened at the end of my report? And similarly, if they should be on some sort of protocol for whatever it is for their heart, like that's out of my purview. So yes, connecting that branch, exactly what you said, very, very huge room for disruption there. So we've gotten a lot of questions now, so I think I'm gonna have to start looking at them here. Let's see. Specific one, what libraries would you say is most useful for building these models? Ooh, that's a nice specific one. Anyone want to stab that one? I have no idea. So if you guys don't know, then.
I mainly, like, it's my personal choice again. I personally use PyTorch and Keras.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I use PyTorch generally speaking because it's pretty functional and I'm used to it. I'm sure there are other things people use, but I think the biggest thing actually in many of these cases for building one of these models often is we're in a place where, the tooling is built on some underlying library, but some of the high level libraries, particularly in NLP with some of the transformers work, a number of different libraries for imaging, some of the data prep stuff that where you spend like 90% of your time is actually getting to the point where it's good enough that it's getting rid of stuff that we used to actually spend a lot of time doing.
Yeah, I'll agree that, our group also uses PyTorch and TensorFlow. But I feel like every week my students are coming in with a new finding of some, either data augmentation library or pre-processing library or data loading for, certain types of image data that they're finding useful. And so I think it's great that there's a active ecosystem of this out there. Oh, I forgot data annotation as one other type of tool. And yeah, I think it's great that there's, so many emerging frameworks and libraries and tools for this.
Yeah,
so,
I was going to say I primarily use PyTorch, but going to Jared's point, I think that as much time is in kind of essentially SQL, R with tidyverse to really get the data to the place where essentially deep learning can be done?
I mean, the amount of time you spend, mucking through, if you have CT data, for instance, and you're just mucking through DICOMs that have like, dot number, dot number, dot number, and you're like, I have no idea what this is. A lot of that tooling, thank God for whoever wrote that, because again, that's like the vast majority of my time.
So a nice bookend to that question is, how can we communicate with clinicians who don't have the AI background to understand what to do with the data? And this is tricky because we are all very familiar with this. People who normally watch the happy hour are pretty familiar with this, but that's still a really small part of like all of our doctor friends in the United States and around the world. So do you guys have any thoughts on how we can bridge those gaps and help the clinicians who aren't as interested in it as we are?
As a industry person that has product and sells into clinicians, our position is that we're solving clinical problems. We just happen to use AI and advanced techniques to do it. We don't necessarily position ourselves as an AI company. We definitely use it, but it's not the way we approach the problem. It's not the way that we communicate it to clinicians. We started, this is the clinical problem that we're solving. This is the validation method, that we did it, whether it's a peer-reviewed paper or something. So kind of talk in their language, and that the model or the information that we're using, and we rarely get into this deep learning model or how they do it. If they ask, we can, but that's a small subset. It's mostly what we're showing you is a numeric and visual representation of a clinical problem, and this is how we validated it.
Great.
I'll also put in maybe a little plug for, I think for clinicians who may be relatively newer to AI who want to, start thinking about these problems. A group of Stanford faculty, including many Amy faculty, have put together a Stanford AI and healthcare specialization that's up on Coursera. Matt Lundgren, the co-director of Amy, and I co-taught one of the courses. Nigam Shah taught another, and others. But anyways, it's a course that doesn't involve any programming, but the main point of it is to help provide the fundamentals to think through what makes a good clinical problem for working on AI. Because not every clinical problem, right, is conducive to AI. So what makes it conducive? How should you think about it? What are the components, sort of basic understanding of AI fundamentals? Then it also covers everything from data to deployment across the different modules of the class. So, I think for those of you who are looking, that maybe one resource for many of us here that could be interesting.
And to add to Serena's point, actually, not only that, actually now also in Emory and also in other universities, they are also adding the basic AI course in the radiology informatics residency background. So that is really good. So at least the residents from the starting day, they would have at least for the radiology part, they would have an idea of the AI, the validation especially. So we are putting more focus on the validation part. So because they don't need to know the nitty gritty of the AI in general, but at least they need to know the validation part. So we are giving a lot of focus on developing those courses for validation of AI.
Yeah, that's awesome, Iman. I didn't know you guys were doing that. I would just 800% second what Iman just said. Part of this is on part of this is helpful, obviously, when you have clinicians who are willing to spend the time to understand what's going under the hood. That's fantastic. And I 800% support that. And that's excellent. On the other hand, we on the, I would say, AI side of this house, we can also do a better job of communicating in language that those folks are used to, and not just that are used to, that they use in their day-to-day existence. If I'm designing a new test and there are specific things, whether I'm in a path lab or it's a drug, whatever it is, if I'm a clinician and I'm going to use a particular test or I'm going to use a particular drug, I may not off the top of my head know exactly the details of all of the biochemistry that goes into it off the top of my head, but I have a very clear idea of what the operating envelope is, where it should be used, what the contraindications are, all of these sorts of things. And I think as we build these models and try to deploy them into practice, can and should frankly take a lot of cues from the medical community who have thought about how to do this for a long time. For sometimes, again, drugs where, for instance, we don't necessarily understand pure 100% how they work, but we've characterized how they work. And those are two different things. And we can communicate how we've characterized how well these models work in a very concrete and precise way, even in cases where communicating the exact nitty gritty, as Iman put it, is can take a lot of time and effort that for some folks may be difficult to access.
And to kind of tie all three of you together is, I mean, medical people love our peer-reviewed papers. And so to kind of tie it into what Susan said, like do the things that everyone just said and get a paper published, like that goes a long way to get a provider kind of, thinking about it. So I very much appreciate the different aspects to answer that question. We have a lot more questions that we're never going to finish them all, but here's one more. Do you have any recommendations for monitoring machine learning systems in healthcare? Now we all have our sensitivity, specificity, area under the curve. We have all those things, but like, how can we like really monitor them if they're deployed in a health system? One of the things that you guys have talked on this happy hour many times is drift, and that's obviously pretty been around for a long time. And so, do you guys have any thoughts on how that can be like done in kind of real time in a hospital system?
I think the magic here is getting that real world data into the system and having it update, the algorithm update with clinical data. I'll go back to Iman's one of her first answers, which the outcome data, like if you could continually incorporate that kind of information into your algorithms. Right now, I'm sure everybody here is more than familiar. We have to take a snapshot of a validated AI system and deploy it. And if we want to redeploy it in a clinical system, we have to retest it in an environment and then deliver it again. So, but if that can be an iterative process in the environment with real world data to upgrade, that's not an easy thing to do, but that's certainly is within the purview of the FDA now to be able to do something and to update these algorithms in the environment.
So just to add to that, like I will tell you how difficult the outcome data collection is. So we are doing a project where we just want to collect the cardiac death, for example, and we have to hire like a research coordinator who has to call all the patient manually, because we have the death data of the patient, but the problem is that sometimes the reason of the death is not accurate in the EHR, right? Somebody has to manually call the family and get to know and validate that this was a cardiac death. And so you can imagine, like it's kind of like very, very difficult to collect those outcome data even.
And I also think that there are many different metrics that you probably want to be using to monitor your deployed algorithms, and that's, as was mentioned, everything ranging from accuracy with respect to different populations, with distribution shift. There's what sorts of biases may be there, what's crept in, what kinds of errors are being made with respect to this, and how all of that shifts over time. And so I think that there's a lot of need to to work on, think through some of these like frameworks for this, both for specific applications and problems, but also then thinking through across different types of applications. What's kind of the shared structure among here, what's a little bit more application specific, and then what makes sense for all of this in kind of a practically feasible and reasonable manner with respect to regulation. And I think a lot of these are more open questions than things that we already know and have, but I think certainly these kinds of starting to try and think through and build out some of these frameworks I think is a big need for that.
From a measuring healthcare data standpoint, there's another question, and I'm not sure if we have the expertise on here, but let's let it fly. The audience member asked it. What is the panel's thoughts on measuring the delta between what was billed and what was read for imaging? Anyone have any thoughts on looking at that different billing versus what was read?
I think there's potentially two features to that question. One of which is that I think there's disparity or discordance between the ICD-9 code, which is the diagnosis associated with the actual interpretation, which is, I think, a huge body of literature why ICD-9 codes often are discordant. But particularly for imaging, the billing for the modality or the scan does not actually correlate very well with the interpretation. So that I think that's probably not the area that I think the audience is asking, but it's just a question of, I think that, we are working with imperfect data sets, and most of those data sets tend to be administrative, so that it is there's a huge body of literature on how to deal with that, or what are the limitations, recognizing those limitations when building models.
Got it. So we're getting close to the end, and there's one question that I kind of saved for the end from the audience. I have about 7 more questions on my list, so we just ran out of time. So you guys did a really awesome job, so thank you. So we'll close out by saying, this is great. It says, this is a young person that's asking, how would you communicate to people who would be skeptical about using artificial intelligence or machine learning in medicine? So go around the Brady Bunch squares here and say, how would you help someone in this? How would you communicate that they might be skeptical? How could you convince them that this is a safe and good thing to do? So how about David? You go first.
Oh, this is a tough question. I wish I was last. Well, I think the first thing I would say is that I think this goes for the question of how do you get to deployment? What are the low-hanging fruits? I don't think that we're anywhere near the idea of self-driving or fully autonomous decision support or something like that. But in terms of what is the low-hanging fruit, I think that the first thing we're going to see is really reproduction of the human workflow, like Jared said. Things that people do but are tedious, things that we measure but don't like to, or is cumbersome, and we can do at scale because it's just better. I think that a lot of those things tend to be very visually recognizable, meaning that you gave the example of measuring the wall thickness. I might not want to measure it because it takes 2 clicks, but I can, in a second or even less, recognize, oh, did I approximate the boundary or did I not approximate the boundary? I think that that's the low-hanging fruit in AI, and I think that's where I hope to see our ability to convince people with that first, before going to more end-to-end, essentially algorithms, or more complex decision support.
How about Serena? Do you have any ways to assuage their fears if AI is going to come in?
Well, first of all, I agree with everything David said, and I think this is it's a very normal question to be asking, really, for many different kinds of AI technologies and disruptive technologies in general. That there's always 2 sides to the coin, and there are many positives, but there's also many can be either unintended consequences, or even things that we feel a little bit scared or uneasy about now. And so it is also something that we've experienced it as we've tried to think through different kinds of AI applications, let's say with new kinds of data or with new sorts of use cases that do have these 2 sides of the coin. And I think that for me, what the way I think about approaching it is sort of trying to get buy-in in terms of what's really the benefits that this can give. And I think that really at the end of the day, clinicians just want to be able to provide the best treatment and care to their patients, and so thinking of and focusing on those positives first as what we want to work towards, and then saying, well, okay, if this is what we want, then how do we be honest and think clearly and transparent about what are also potentially the flip side of things, not brush it under the rug and sort of with just all the AI magic being sprinkled around, but also face those. And really, I think the best way to confront potential negative consequences is to think about them from the very beginning, and to be able to really incorporate that into the design of the actual application, and because there's a lot of different ways you can design any given use case, and I think that's the best way to try and get as much of the positive as we can, while also sort of mitigating, accounting for, or at least becoming more comfortable and figuring out what to do about any unintended consequences that could arise.
Cool. I think we have time for one more person if they want to say how they could help give someone some confidence about the AI. Is there one more that wants to volunteer to give a thought? Sure, go ahead, Susan.
I'll go for 10. I'll be very brief. There's a lot of information out there. There's doctors are overloaded with time, and they don't have enough time. There's too much information. AI is certainly it won't be advanced till it's clinically ready. It's there to make not only doctors, but the medical practice in general better.
And I'll just say there's always a baseline. Like if you have built an AI system to do something, ask yourself, what was the baseline? How would I have done it without this thing? And if the answer is very clearly and very measurably, worse, then you have a pretty good argument for using it. If the answer is, well, I don't know, maybe the thing I was doing before was actually just fine, it's pretty hard to convince people. So just designing your workflows with that in mind is a pretty good start.
And I personally believe that I was exactly in that position, that being like trained in computer science, I was skeptical using AI in medicine. But the thing is that I gained trust because I was working with the doctors, like clinicians from the beginning. And they actually helped me understand that how the AI can benefit their workflow and what kind of AI could be really helpful in their workflow. And that made me more confident about the AI in general.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. This was great. We had so many questions from the audience. This was awesome. So thank you for all of your individual expertise. Enjoy the rest of your Friday and have a good rest of your weekend.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks, Ty.
Bye.
Thanks, Ty.
Bye.